Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and these are my 5 tips for taking on Murloc Paladin. Murloc Paladin is a deck that has some variations, but it's one that's been around basically since early into the Unguro expansion, and is still a very prominent part of the meta, and I think it's actually even picking up a little bit of steam right now once again. So maybe now more than ever, you probably need to learn how to beat Murloc Paladin, because it is something you're going to consistently encounter on the ranked ladder, and I have 5 tips that will help you accomplish exactly that. So let's go ahead and jump into this list. Starting off with my first tip, when you go into a game against Paladin, the first thing you really need to do is try to figure out which list they're running. So there is always the potential that they're running like some sort of super N'Zoth control Paladin. That's the first thing you need to figure out. Is this truly Murloc Paladin, or is this some sort of control Paladin? There are clues there. They run things like Wild Pyromancer or perhaps Acolyte of Pain. They're probably going to be more of a control Paladin. If you see some Death Rattles pop in there early game, almost definitely some sort of N'Zoth Paladin. But on the other side of things, even within the Murloc Paladin decks, there's a lot of variation. Sometimes they're much faster Murloc Paladin decks that are more of a zoo style, more aggressive, more about all early game Murloc bodies that don't run very many late game cards. There's also the more mid-range style of Murloc Paladin that runs things like Stampeding Kodo and Primordial Drake along with the Curator, that sort of package. So sometimes you'll get clues that they're more of a mid-range deck. And oftentimes it's just impossible to tell, but there are some things that you can cue into. If you see really hyper-aggressive Murlocs in the early game, like perhaps Grimscale Oracle or Bluegill Warrior, you're almost definitely facing a faster Murloc list, and you're not going to have to worry about some of those late-game cards. If you don't see those, and perhaps they get off to a slower start or don't seem to hit the perfect curve, then there might be a higher chance they're running the mid-range variant and they have some of those late-game cards just sitting in their hand dead, so they're not hitting and firing on all cylinders, and that can really help you adjust your play. So if you know you're playing a faster deck, you might be able to use your removal earlier, try to stabilize earlier, take bigger chances just to stay up on the board and maintain your health total. If you think you're playing a deck that has some of those more late-game cards and can go toe-to-toe in the value game in the late game, you might need to save some of your resources to contest. You might need to focus more on card draw instead of onboard presence or tempo. So it can really adjust how you play the matchup, but you have to take the clues that they present and make a conclusion, or you're not going to be able to adjust your play. So try to figure out their list to the best of your ability using the clues that they have, and for that you'll probably need to review various Murloc Paladin lists to really see which cards they tend to run, and then as soon as you see one of those cards that only that version of the list runs, then you know for sure what deck you're playing against. And often you can kind of deduce it even before then, just based on the way they play the game and context clues within the matchup, and that'll really help you determine how to play and then find wins that you otherwise wouldn't find if you played it like you were playing the wrong kind of deck. Moving on to my second tip, this one might kind of just sound obvious like Hearthstone advice, but it's actually pretty relevant to Murloc Paladin specifically, and that's that you shouldn't play into some of the removal answers that they have when you can avoid it. In other words, for instance, it's a deck that tends to run True Silver Champion. So playing a 4 health minion going into their turn 4 might not be the smartest thing if perhaps you could play 2 health minions instead. Of course, there's also Consecration to worry about. So sometimes you don't want to play 4 2 health things going into their turn 4. You could play 1 or 2 medium-sized things to help you dodge Consecration and still not give them full value out of True Silver Champion. It goes far beyond just those 2 cards as well, though. For instance, there's things like Stampeding Kodo and Primordial Drake that are both run in versions of Murloc Paladin, so you probably shouldn't play a 2-attack minion into turn 5 if you're expecting it to get removed from Stampeding Kodo. If you have to, play that on turn 6, so maybe they have to float a mana and don't get to utilize their turn 6 Spike Ridge Steed, and they're playing just a little bit off curve. You can adjust your plays and shift your play style a little bit to make things line up more poorly for them and make it a little bit more frustrating for them to achieve the most value out of each of their cards. Similarly, you might not want to go wide on a board into turn 8 if you're expecting Primordial Drake to come out. This can get even more complex than that with things like Sunkeeper Tarim. For instance, If they're going into turn 6 and they have a couple small minions on the board, that looks like it might be a good Sunkeeper Tarium turn, so you probably shouldn't, for instance, play a Bittertide Hydra or some really big high health threat into that turn 6, because they're going to have a fantastic opportunity to swing things with Sunkeeper Tarium, where of course they debuff your really powerful minion and then just trade into it very efficiently with hers, while also still achieving some value by buffing a secondary minion or two. So you got to dodge opportunities like that. If, for instance, you think they have a good Sunkeeper Tarium board, perhaps you should play 2 or 3 smaller things instead to mitigate the risk of that Sunkeeper Tarium, or make them feel a little bit bad by buffing your minions and denying them that opportunity, so that you have to reshuffle their plays and provide some friction essentially in what they're trying to accomplish. That's another important one to keep in mind. But essentially they have all kinds of different little things throughout the course of the game where they're going to be trying to answer your threats. And if you know which ones tend to line up on which turns, or at least think about how the mana is appropriated in a given turn, then you can really influence their gameplay decisions in a negative way to give yourself the maximum opportunity to benefit. On the other side of that is actually my number 3 tip, and that's that Murloc Paladin is one of those decks that does have really big key threats that tend to come down on key turns. Some decks, they just play on curve, they have a lot of middle-sized stuff, nothing that really stands out, and you can kind of just play it out. But with Murloc Paladin specifically, they have so many key cards that you really do need to plan out your resources in advance and make sure that you have some sort of answer to whatever threat that might come out. Of course, the shining example of this is Tirion Forgeling on turn 8. You might need to save that Hex or that Polymorph for Tirion Forgeling. If your deck doesn't have any other way to answer Tirion, perhaps you need to adjust your playstyle in a way that you don't answer Tirion, but in fact you just kill them before you get that far, right? Like, because if you know Tyrion's going to instantly win them the game, you have to perhaps go all in and take some risks that you otherwise wouldn't take. So either save that answer, have that answer, or adjust your play in a way that ignores that problem in the first place so that you don't need the answer. But it really goes beyond just Tirion Forgeling with Murloc Paladin. As I mentioned, they have a lot of those threats. For instance, there is Finja on turn 5. Maybe you have a Stampeding Kodo and you need to use it on Finja on turn 5. Maybe you run Deadly Shot and you need to save it for Finja on turn 5 to deny them that value. One of the biggest and most unpredictable threats, and the things that people don't often think about saving removal for, is actually Murloc Warleader. If they land a big Murloc Warleader, you can really be in trouble. So perhaps you have to save that Eaglehorn Bow or that Frostbolt for the Murloc Warleader so that when it comes down, you have an answer. Maybe you have to save removal for a double Murloc Warleader, and you need to be able to do 4 damage to a couple minions, or 4 damage and then 3 damage to the subsequent Murloc Warleader. So you really have to think about what is going to be the thing that kills me and what's going to be the thing that wins them the game. What minion is going to be decisive for their victory? And do I have a way to answer that? Am I prepared for that threat? And you can adjust your play, save some resources, shuffle around some cards, play a minion preemptively that you know makes a favorable trade. For instance, there's a lot of things you can do to ensure that you're ready for all the big threats that Murloc Paladin can provide. Because not every deck requires you to have as many answers as does Murloc Paladin. They just have a lot of very significant high impact minions in there that you need to address. Moving on to my 4th tip, it's that you need to keep Murlocs off the board when you can. Now that might be another one that sounds a little bit simple, but sometimes you really have to go overboard as far as making trades and keeping those Murlocs in check. A lot of the times, for instance, in a matchup, you might feel like you don't have to answer their minions and you can just apply some pressure face, force them to trade back, etc., etc. But with Murloc Paladin, they have so many ways to take advantage of that Murloc tribal synergy that you just simply can't risk it. First and foremost, that Murloc Warleader can come down and just add a pile of stats onto your Murlocs. They also have the Gentle Megasaur to adapt all those Murlocs, and they can do crazy things with +3 attack, Wind Fury, Divine Shield, etc. Again, you simply can't risk it. Frankly, against Murloc Paladin, you should try to keep minions off the board at all costs, not just Murlocs, because they also have buffs like Spike Ridge Steed and Blessing of Kings, and if they have those minions laying around, guess what? You're giving those buffs charge in essence by leaving a minion that's already ready to attack. And if you can keep minions off the board, and if they have to play a minion and buff it in the same turn, then that buff basically has to sit there for a turn and doesn't get instant and immediate value like it otherwise might. So even the Silverhand Recruits are good to remove, but the Murlocs are key to remove just because there's so many ways to take advantage of them in this deck. So sometimes making bad, inefficient trades is still worth it because of the upside and the potential for them to really swing a board and flip a game in their favor if they're able to utilize Murlocs that are already on the board, ready to attack and to absorb those buffs from War Leader and everything else that the deck can actually do. So be ready to make bad trades, keep the Murlocs off the board, and you'll find a lot of success. And then finally, for my fifth and final tip, really this one's kind of a summary of all of the previous tips, and basically every previous tip has led into this one a little bit. But essentially you need to deny the Murloc Paladin the opportunity to make really big plays, because this is a deck that can just do crazy things all at once and just win the game on the back of a single turn's really big play. So for instance, we've already talked about a few of these, right? Like you keep the Murlocs off the board so they don't hit the huge Murloc War Leader or the huge Gentle Megasaur play. You keep minions off the board going into turn 6 so they aren't able to use Spike Ridge Steed. And frankly, you keep minions off the board all the time so they never give Spike Ridge Steed that instant charge value. You can play really high health minions into turn 5 so that they are denied the opportunity to actually kill a minion with Finja. Because remember, Finja does have to actually kill the minion. So if you play high health stuff, you might deny them the opportunity to utilize Finja and actually get value, meaning they kind of played 5 mana and it's just sitting there not doing anything. That one's a little bit risky because of course they can buff their Finja, but you can still try your best to play around those big plays. You can set yourself up in a way where if they play Tyrion, you know you have an answer and you just overwhelm them with minions or something, right? There's all kinds of ways that when they try to make those big plays, if you have already thought about that and you've done something proactive or saved some resources or some answers or played in a way that makes those big plays less opportunistic, then you'll find victory a lot more often. As long as you're denying those opportunities and making every turn for them a little bit awkward, a little bit harder, they're not going to be able to do those huge plays that just frankly win them the game. So what you really need to do is think, how can they win this game? If you're already ahead, what can they do to swing this game back in their favor? What kind of play would put them in the game? What would ensure that I absolutely lose? Figure that out. Once you answer that question, then you can play in ways to deny those opportunities. But you have to actually critically think, how can I lose this game? What can they do to win? And then design your plays, lay out a game plan for yourself that removes the opportunity for them to actually accomplish those sort of swing plays. Of course, sometimes you just don't have the ability and they're going to do it, but to the best of your ability, to the best of the cards that are available to you, if you can deny those big plays, you're going to find success. And there you have it. Those are my 5 tips for beating Murloc Paladin. This is very much a beatable deck as long as you play it correctly. Sometimes they just get those crazy high tempo early starts and you can't win. But if they don't just high roll you, you do really have a lot of influence on how this matchup goes. As long as you're thinking actively all the time about your best plays and thinking a turn or two ahead and really playing around the cards they have that do very specific, niche, unique things. If you understand what those cards do, when they're likely to play them, and how you can deny them the ability to accomplish big things, you're going to win games. You're going to beat them when you otherwise wouldn't have. So be sure you go into this matchup with some strategy, with a level head, and I think you're going to win a lot more than you might think. So all of that said, if you guys have any thoughts, comments, questions, tips of your own, of course, for beating Murloc Paladin, I'd love to hear them in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, game on.